Thanks for joining us. I'm sorry that we're getting started late. I was not paying attention to time as I was talking. This is the state of the LGBTIQ movement. These are some of my friends who have gathered. And we're just going to have a conversation. I have a few questions. They've seen them in advance. And we're going to talk about pressing social concerns within the LGBTIQ movements, ways in which it intersects with other pressing social concerns that are happening in today's world, and ways in which we can entangle ourselves together in the call for mutual liberation for us all. So I'm wondering if we can just start by saying who we are, who we represent, the kind of work we do, and then I have no order of preference in terms of who answers the first question, but maybe just so that we can.
I'm so sorry, I got lost.
That's okay. I wasn't paying attention to time. We just got started. So maybe we can just kind of go down the row here and say who we are, our affiliation, the work that we're doing, and then we'll start off with the first question.
I am Jennifer Yoder. My close friends call me Jay. I use they, them, their. I am Communications and Engagement Director at Christian Peacemaker Teams, and I co-founded a group for queer celebration in the Mennonite Church, which is my home denomination. And I'm generally a social justice, nonviolence organizer and activist.
Hi, I'm AnaYelsi Sanchez, she and her pronouns, and I'm the Mid-Atlantic organizer for the Reformation project. So we're working specifically on equipping people with a strong theological argument for full affirmation and inclusion, specifically in evangelical community.
I'm Broderick Greer. I am a senior at Virginia Theological Seminary across the river. I am studying to be a priest in the Episcopal Church and will be ordained next month. And I have been involved via social media and speaking events and conversations about the role of LGBTQIA people in the life of the church. And I use he, his, him.
Hi, I'm Sharon Groves, and I don't know what I'm doing with my life. I just left a job at the Human Rights Campaign where I directed the Religion and Faith program, and I was there for about 10 years. And I'm in a transition period. I'm doing some consulting work, but my passion is the deep work of transformation on LGBT issues and racial justice, and thinking about that in the long term. So what's our 10-year strategy? And then how do we build down from there, as opposed to working at that kind of frenetic pace of one campaign after another. So I'm trying to figure out what that looks like.
I'm Rowe. I am the Associate Regional Field Director at the Human Rights Campaign. I go from campaign to campaign. And sometimes specialize in our faith field outreach and working with communities of color. But specifically, most of my work right now revolves around fighting religious refusal bills in the South. So that's what most of my time is spent doing right now. I come out of the anti-racism welfare rights movement in Detroit. My father's a pastor from there. And I lived in North Carolina for 10 years and worked with Dr. Barber and the Moral Monday movement. So that's where I cut my teeth and kind of the model that I use in the work that I do.
Great, thanks. So let's get started. So what I want us to think about is marriage equality. Now that many states have marriage equality, does this help advance liberation for LGBTIQ communities and sexual minorities? And relatedly, does marriage equality as a national agenda stunt liberation for LGBTIQ communities and sexual minorities?
was waiting to see if anyone else would start this off. I was involved in a lot of the marriage work. Both Ryan and I were at HRC, and I think the answer to that question, from my perspective, is that it's incredibly nuanced. I think that we're having conversations now that we would not have had 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and that's in part because of the way that this issue has risen. And I do think that marriage equality, whatever you think about that as the direction for the movement, that it has actually opened doors to all kinds of conversations around what does LGBT justice look like. So I think that we're having conversations now we wouldn't have had before. So I want to put that out there. On the other hand, I know this is another question you're going to ask. I don't want to get too far ahead on this, but I do think that one of the struggles around campaign work around marriage is that the way that it's often done, and this is not a judgment, it's just kind of the nature of the beast, is that you have to put your most heteronormative folks forward. And so what that then does is that we end up in a situation where we do marginalize people within the community in order to do the work. And I think that we have to recognize that that's part of what's happening. And so there was, Robyn, you were part of this, and Jen, you were there too, but I remember we were at Creating Change, and there was a woman in a panel that we were on who talked about being at her church and not being the right kind of gay. That's how she put it. That because of economic issues, because she didn't look the part, she didn't look heteronormative enough, that she didn't have the money, she didn't feel at all like that was a welcoming space. And I think that there are ways that the marriage equality movement has created a kind of two-class system, and we have to really pay attention to that. So for me, it's a nuanced space.
Yeah, and I think that we are having a lot of these conversations, like Sharon was saying, because of the high-profile nature of gay marriage equality struggles in our country, and it has sadly been to the detriment to so many other issues facing sexual minorities. So great, come June, maybe we'll have gay marriage in all 50 states. But there's, 21 states where you can still be fired for being LGBT. We are still facing so many issues with youth homelessness, bullying, suicide, these right to refuse laws in many, many different states across our country. So sadly, marriage equality has become a distraction for a broader agenda and a broader coalition in LGBT communities. This is not a monolithic movement. This is not a monolithic community. This is a coalition of communities, and therefore a coalition of issues that must be addressed, issues that are much broader than marriage equality.
Yeah, I just want to affirm what Broderick and Sharon both said, but I think for me, one of my great area of concerns is what's happening for people of color within the LGBT community. And the sentiment or the feedback that I've heard from so many of my conversations is this feeling of it feels like a repeating of history of that wait your turn conversation that's constantly happening. Well, this is the easiest thing to fight for. This is where people are just more comfortable putting their money and their time and their energy, and therefore this is what we're going to do first. And when we win this, then we'll get to housing, then we'll get to jobs, then we'll get to the trans woman of color who are being murdered, but after we deal with marriage equality. And it's not to say that there aren't people of color who very much want to be married, who are a part of communities working for that. If you watch documentaries like The New Black, there are people who worked in the African American community in churches actively for that. but there are many other concerns as well, and it feels a lot like we're just starting that whole game over again of just wait your turn, and I think that that's where a lot of the pushback and the frustration is coming from.
And I also want to say yes to everything everyone has said. And I think that the push for marriage equality reinforces a bullshit heteronormative way of relating that is privileged by a system that marginalizes all of us, right? And so, I mean, I come from a place where I want to destroy marrying rights and privileges in our system to a particular way of relating. So, yeah, I mean, yes, marriage marginalizes all of the other issues, homelessness, bullying, violence. It's been a particularly violent year and deadly year for trans women of color. And, yeah, I understand the nuance, but I'm real angry.
So I should start by saying that I'm an ally in many senses of the word. I'm straight, white, Christian, college educated, and somehow God has me doing this work. So I guess yes, I would affirm what everyone said there, and where I sit in the nuance is a very politically focused one, which is the fact that we tried for 20-some years to pass a comprehensive federal law to protect people in the workplace, so I think that the way we frame these questions can get us into some trouble about an either or, that we need to be in the street, we need to be walking hand in hand with the most invisible, marginalized people, and when you do the cultural normative thing, you're less invisible. Then these issues are less invisible, and the conversations open easier to do that work. And so it's a both and that I think is no one's master. So I'll just add that.
That's great. I mean, I started with that because, that's the national agenda these days, right? And I feel like we need to start quick.
Can I add just one more thing? I think what you just said reminded me of this, is that one of the really tragic crises that we're seeing is that it's been the national agenda, and yet, because we've put so much focus on it as a national agenda, that LGBT movements are in a crisis right now, from the highest and most affluent, from like the HRCs, down to the small local community group. And one of the things that we see happen is that when you have marriage that passes in a state, then the state local group that may have been around for 10, 20 years is scrambling just to survive, because we put all our focus and our money and our imagination, as much as anything, on getting political victories. And so it is a political victory that I think can have I think it can trickle and shift other political victories, but when there is such a limited imagination about what we need to do, what we're seeing is actually a really kind of very sad moment where you're seeing a kind of an ending of a lot of LGBTQ activism that is getting supported because we're winning on marriage. So winning becomes kind of this death knell in a funny kind of way.
Well, and the entrenchment of capitalism within marriage systems, right? We won't go there. We don't have to. How have you seen race play a part in the work for LGBTIQ justice? What are your examples, and where has intersectionality failed?
So I think it was last month or the month before. As you are aware, we have 6 openly gay ambassadors of the United States of America who have been appointed by the President of the United States of America. And there was a panel at the museum down the street, we were talking about this at lunch today, of the 6 gay ambassadors. And of course, the picture comes up on social media, and they all look the same. They're all white, middle-aged men who are wealthy, who have given lots of money to the administration, and that's who ambassadors tend to be. White, wealthy, middle-aged men, sometimes women. And so I think it is just, that picture symbolized so much, and the president of HRC, Chad Griffin, was at this event as well. So it's this alignment of this kind of corporate LGBT structure that's in place that has, you know, the sanctioning and the approval of the administration. And so it's just really fascinating to say these men, these white, middle-aged, wealthy men, cisgender men, are the face of what it means to be gay in America, or at least what it means to be gay in the Obama administration. And so we can acknowledge, yes, this is a step in the right direction. We've never had this many openly gay ambassadors before. But when they look exactly like the United States Senate and almost all of the governors of all the states in the United States, there's a problem, because that is not my experience of being a gay person, a queer person. I am not a white, cisgender, wealthy, middle-aged man who vacations in Barbados. You know, like, that's just not my thing. And that's not the experience of so many queer people. And so that erasure of the experiences of people of color, of women of color, of trans people, is troubling, at least troubling.
So I'm going to talk specifically about our about Pink Minnow, this smallish group in the Mennonite Church working for queer inclusion. I don't even know where to start. The Mennonite Church USA uses a tactic that a lot of institutions use of making it seem like there's only so many seats at the table, and you know, if queer people want to be there, then that pushes out people of color, and if people of color want to be there, then queer folks can't be there, and queer folks are being racist by asking to be there. So we have we have problems in our community, and these problems fall most heavily on our queer people of color. One of our members is Black and genderqueer and queer, and is the darling of one of our Mennonite colleges, and was asked to lead the YouTube recruitment video, you know, runs all around campus about how great of a college it is to recruit new students, preaches to the seminary, leads the march on MLK Day, and then for their senior play was doing Corpus Christi, and was playing Gay Jesus, and the play was shut down and not allowed to happen, so they couldn't complete the requirements of their degree. They were granted a pass to be able to graduate without completing that, but this is the experience of our queer people of color in the Mennonite Church, is that the Mennonite Church is at a place where they really want to show that they're doing anti-racist work, and so they get real excited when there are people of color who identify as Mennonite who are willing to be leaders. But if they also reveal that they're queer, they are booted out as quickly as they were lifted up. And so that's a huge way that intersectionality is failing in our church and in our movement.
I know for us, for our organization, for the Reformation Project, we were very early in our formation. We keep saying we're in our infancy as an organization. And one of the blessings of that is that we're still creating our culture, and we're still putting together, understanding what the DNA of our culture is going to be. And as an ally myself, I can't speak to the LGBT experience, but I can speak to walking through this world as a person of color, and I've been able to add that voice to the organization, and honestly have much more frank, open conversations with people who are queer people of color that they wouldn't necessarily have with other members of our staff. But in having those conversations and in beginning to push back and us trying to show that we do want to decenter whiteness in this movement, and that we do want to begin offering a platform to people of color, I've noticed tensions and pushback and experiences that tell me that, at least as of yet, like, yes, we're failing when it comes to intersectionality. We're failing when it comes to realizing that people don't live single issue lives. I love Audre Lorde, right? Love it. That phrase comes to me constantly because it's so true. And getting that across to people has proven to be difficult. To give an example, like, I have a degree of a lack of trust for some of the leading voices in this movement, the leading white voices in this movement, and not even questioning sincerity, but questioning understanding or education on these issues. There's someone who is an incredible person who works with our organization, is in the space where we're trying to teach about issues of color and the intersection with LGBT movement. We go around the table to introduce ourselves. We get to me, and I say, I'm AnaYelsi, I'm Venezolana, and she busts out laughing, and she says, you're what? And I said, I'm Venezolana, it means I'm Venezuelan from Venezuela. And she's laughing again, she says, I don't know what you're saying, I don't understand what you're saying right now. And then she proceeds to say, it sounds like you're saying Chihuahua, I'm just gonna say you're Chihuahua. This is a leader in our movement, a wonderful person, but in that respect, that's an immense failure and created a void and a trust that I'm still not sure has been rebuilt. So how can I say, yes, go and talk to so-and-so, she will totally be willing to engage your experience of your intersection of your race and ethnicity and being an LGBT person. I don't know that I can say that with confidence. No, I do know that I could not say that with confidence. And to me, like, that is symbolic or emblematic of the entire situation. That we people in positions of power, when it comes to this intersection, they don't know what they're doing.
Well, I think the short answer to this question for me is that race plays a part in everything that I do, because white supremacy is at the core of the injustice and the system of injustice in this country, in my opinion, at the core of how it manifests in homophobia and transphobia. And intersectionality has failed everywhere we've tried it. I think we have some real successes. I think we have models out there. Southerners on new ground are just going to tell me to get off of their stuff. But I love them as the model that I always point to as people who live intersectionality. The cognitive dissonance of all this is that we are the intersections, that we are being told to leave parts of our identity at the door, as you just sort of illustrated. And that can happen in a communal sense too. And as we get nervous about talking about gay ink and we work at gay ink or whatever, that's not new for me because I'm a Christian. I mean, that's a part of being an American and a Christian, a part of institutions that are psychologically falling apart because of the core contradiction of their identity. I'm a United Methodist. We always talk about the irony of our motto versus our policy, right? People are laughing, I don't even need to say it, right? Open hearts, open minds, open doors, right? I'm a a United Methodist. I'm proud of that, and I take that on. So obviously, coming out of the Moral Monday movement, that's the model that I try and perpetuate. It's a beautiful example of Southern-based intersectionality. And in that experience with my friends who come from Psalm, who come from the Black church, who come from reproductive rights, you see all these beautiful flags, you see 80,000 people. That started as like 15 people in front of Jones Street. And when we had those conversations, and we were at the table during the Amendment 1 campaign, where it was the first visible sort of, we got to, where do you stand? Which side are you on moment? There were some times where we had to stop and say, there's racism in the room. There's homophobia in the room. We're supposed to be the good guys. Of course there is. Intersectionality is supposed to fail. And so a part of taking that on is being willing to see your own racism and homophobia and create a table where, what I think the beauty of those moments were is that people were willing to fail. Were willing to come and say, I want to take this stance in my Black church, and I know we have a journey to come to. And I want to take this stance as the LGBT organization in this community, and I know we have a lot of work. And as we started this, those aren't two mutually exclusive communities. So it means that in that act, in that prophetic act, a lot of folks who are invisible have to come to the fore and be heard and come into leadership. So how do you undo the doing? It's sort of darkest before the dawn, in my opinion. So that's just sort of my take, is that we fail everywhere we try to do the right thing because the system is set for us to do the wrong thing. And if failure is your marker, then you're in the wrong business, in my humble opinion. Maybe Jesus. Sorry.
I agree that white supremacy is the problem. I'm right with you. And when I left HRC, I spent about 3 weeks. The first thing I did was to go to South Africa. And I remember that in Johannesburg, where the Constitution Hill is, it's built on a prison there. And the prison was a prison that Mahatma Gandhi as well as Nelson Mandela were in. And so there's right in the center of town, and it's a museum now. But one of the things that happened was, as many of you probably know, is that this was a prison that had a space for white prisoners, colored prisoners, and Black prisoners. And the difference between things like the fat in the diet of those different prisoners, which are all segregated from each other, was calculated, right? So that the meals for white prisoners were, you had a choice of meat. For the colored prisoners, you got the gravy from the meat that the white prisoners had. And for the Black prisoners, you would get rice water. And it was charted and put on actual, they have documents of this. And it just got me thinking about what is the way in which white supremacy works to actually keep us from doing the work that we need to do together, right? And I've been thinking a lot about, as a white lesbian woman that does well in a heteronormative culture, what's the stake for me in this conversation? And I think that the work that white folks need to do right now is a lot of work around just getting angry about what white supremacy is doing to us. I think there's so much, right now we're in a kind of, white people sort of get depressed and nervous and guilty and shameful, and then ask people of color to kind of take care of us. Or tell us that we're really, 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 really cool because we're different than other people. And that's kind of how we operate in the world. And we're often really distrustful of other white people that are progressive because our credibility will go down if there's somebody else in the room that is also white and anti-racist. It's a very weird dynamic. We need to be talking a whole lot more about that and actually addressing how white supremacy hurts us. And I think until we really make that real for ourselves, we're just going to be in this weird replicating system. And I think it's Maya Angelou that says that courage is the most important virtue, and without it, you can't be consistent on any of the others. And so I think it's important for us to just to get a little pissed off and be courageous in this space. So.
I'm going to ask the question for the group, and I'm going to follow it with a direct question for Sharon, because I think some of your work around the Summer Institute relates to the question I'm asking, and I'm just wondering if you would start, because I know you can do it. This is a conversation we have for 4 years, okay? You can do this. What are your own strategies to destabilize the overwhelming whiteness that fuels the LGBTIQ movement, especially in light of corporate structures that are advocating for, in particular, L and G folk? That would be lesbian and gay white folk. If you needed an example, that would be the HRC. And my question for Sharon directly is, I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about the project that you started in the Summer Institute as a strategy of radically destabilizing both theological education and the institutionalization of Gay Inc. in producing partnerships like Nikki and Robyn, right? That we talked about the failure of intersectionality, and there have been some failures in the Summer Institute. But I'm wondering if you can just share with us a little bit about how productive that project is as a strategy of yours.
So you didn't plan me, you didn't prepare me for this question exactly. So anyhow,
I didn't. I'm sorry.
And yeah, and I'm sure others on here would have other stories, that people out there that would be similar. But the Summer Institute was a program that I did for about 5 years, and it was the Summer Institute for theologians and religious scholars. And we got some money to bring about 15 people that were finishing their master's degree and planned to go on to a doctoral program or some kind of equivalency, or were beginning a doctoral program. And the idea initially was to begin to change the conversation around LGBTQ issues in higher education so that would trickle down into the church. Well, that was not smart, and that never really happened. And it was like the people that came to the Summer Institute were all coming from progressive spaces anyhow. But what it did emerge into was this amazing place where people like Robyn and scholar activists could really discern how to be able to break through silos in a time when all of our institutions are failing us. The church is failing us, academia is failing us, media is failing us. I mean, there are very few places for people to go. It's very hard for people now to be able to find full-time jobs at any one place. It's a very different culture than it was when I was growing up. So I think what the Institute, what we ended up doing was kind of just loving on some of the voices that were emerging, and we're trying to figure out how to do the long-term work that was both theological, theoretical, but that had some accountability to activist communities. And it was the most, it was the first thing that was defunded when I left HRC, and for my money, it was the most significant, which isn't much these days, but it was the most significant work that I ever did, because what it was about raising new voices and seeing new voices in conversation across organizational locations. So that was that's the work, I think, and so I guess to the actual larger question around what are some strategies, I think that, I think it kind of gets at what I was saying before, that for those of us that have some level of privilege and power, that rather than just being guilty about having a level of privilege and power, it's like the question is, what are you doing with it? How are you sharing the space? How are you bringing in new people? How can you figure out a way for sometimes it means that you're not the central voice in a location. That's really can be very hard for us. How do you do that? I think that's kind of a lot of the work that I personally was trying to figure out how to do. And then just to allow moments which I just think are divine moments, where people can talk to each other and then just shine and let things happen, and then try as best you can to support the new stuff that comes out, rather than to try to control it into an agenda that you might have. Is that what you want me to say?
That's great.
Can you ask the question again?
Yep. What are your own strategies to destabilize the overwhelming whiteness that fuels the LGBTIQ movement, especially in light of corporate structures or ecclesial structures that are advocating for, in particular, L and G white folk?
Yeah, I just show up places and I'm just black. That's really what I have to do, is just show up in places where they're all white and be black and tell my story and not allow white supremacy to continue to colonize my mind and my narrative and my fears. I have a friend, his Facebook status a few months ago, he said, "You're afraid of me because I am inhabited by the spirit of my ancestors. I am undead, fearless, and unchained." And if I had a tattoo, that would probably be my tattoo somewhere. But that's my mantra. My people were enslaved. It's disgusting and terrible. But they were incredibly strong people with great ingenuity and resilience, and that's genetic. I've inherited that from them. And that's my narrative that I have to own. And so when I'm in a white space, I'm not quoting George fucking Washington and Abraham Lincoln was good. He's okay. It's nuanced. He's better than George Washington. We can say that. And I'm not quoting Karl Barth. I'm not quoting European continental theologians or white American theologians, because that's not my narrative. I've gotten to a point, I don't read books written by white people anymore. I don't quote white people anymore, because I think I could do that the rest of my life and still not make up for all the times I have quoted and allowed whiteness and white supremacy to colonize my mind. And so it's very important for people of color to just tell the truth about their lives and say, this is what I've experienced. This is how white supremacy has stripped me of my dignity and my voice. Nothing scarier than a literate person of color who's not only literate, but can write about it. Can really actually articulate what white supremacy is and its evil and its impact on our lives. That's you will not believe the number of inbox messages I get on a daily basis. Why are you saying this? Why are you calling for this? And of course, I send them all, they all say the same thing. So I now have a message that I just keep, that I send to each white person that sends me a message. Because these narratives and these tapes that people play of white supremacy are the same. And so my response is the same every time. I'm not listening to you. You don't get the chance to tell me what to think. And I know that upsets you, but that's how it is. And I probably use some expletives as well.
Well, I think there's the how am I engaging it on the personal level, and then there's the through the avenue afforded to me through the organization I work for. But yeah, I think a lot of times for me, I feel like my job, like, is just to make people uncomfortable, and to be intentional about it. And that doesn't, I don't mean for the sake of being antagonistic, but for the sake of waking people up and forcing them to acknowledge conversations or have conversations that they honestly are not willing to have otherwise. And the way that kind of lives itself out through my job is, you know, Matthew, who's my boss, kind of jokes sometimes of like, that I'm that voice in the room, even when I'm not in the room, that anytime he has an interaction or something's happening, he's like, this is how AnaYelsi would respond to that. Or, oh, no, she would stand up and say something right there, and so now I'm going to stand up and say something. And so I feel like that's kind of become my role of like pushing. Because I feel like otherwise it doesn't happen. There's this complacency that we just have accepted of like, that's fine and that's okay. And as long as no one questions it, it must mean that everyone in the room is all right with it. But in reality, the people of color in the room are uncomfortable and hurting and angry and frustrated and dying inside and just being really quiet about it because no one's given us a place to say something. And I feel like my job is just to take that space and say it. Whether or not the invitation's been provided to me. Because if I wait on the invitation, I'll be here all day. So there's that. For us as an organization, part of that intentionality that I was talking about as we're crafting our culture is, you know, we do these conferences and we do these leadership trainings, and we're devoting a huge portion of them. One, and I love what you were saying about not reading white theologians anymore, but of bringing Black and Latino and Asian American and Native voices in and saying, like, you speak and teach on this and you be the authority because you already are. Asian people are acting like you don't exist. And a lot of times in the beginning, and I think Matthew will be okay with me sharing this because he's past this point, but at first he'll be like, well, they're not out there. I just don't know who they are. I don't hear the voices. Like, well, you're not trying hard enough. Like, you need to do more. Try harder because they're out there. Like, I don't accept that. That's not an excuse. You're not trying hard enough. So there's that of pushing, and making sure that we're trying to find those voices. But then for those that we're serving, who were coming to be trained as leaders, like, we're very intentionally giving them just the beginning pieces of understanding what this is about. So we have parts of our training where it's like, this is what racism is. This is what white supremacy is. This is a microaggression. And we're going to talk about it until you get it and internalize it and can speak on it with authority, even if it means you giving up some of your own power. Because a lot of the people in the room are, right now, they're white people. And the reason we're not bringing in enough people of color in our organization is we don't have a space where it's safe yet. So those are two of the things that we're doing to try and create that space where they will finally join us. Because I know as a person of color, invite me to a room and it's full of white people doing, that was to be really frank, white people doing white things, like, I'm not super interested in that. So we need to create a space where, like, it's actually multicultural, actually multi-ethnic, ethnic, and actually invites something that challenges the norm or the default, and the default right now is whiteness. And that's something that we're working to eliminate.
So you said your job is to make people uncomfortable. My job is to get real uncomfortable a lot, and to sit in discomfort and to know that it's going to be uncomfortable, and that is where the growth is, and that's where that's my whiteness resisting giving up power, and to work with my other white community members to get ready to get uncomfortable. It's to speak into spaces even when it's uncomfortable, and then to be ready to held accountable when I need to be held accountable. In the Mennonite church, again, if we're talking about Pink Meadow, it was learning to resist that logic of white supremacy that I would show up for people of color and then they would show up for me. It's not an exchange, and there is not the same amount at stake for everybody. So I learned to show up for like the anablactivists when they need me, and know that sometimes they're just not going to be able to show up for me. Yes, in many situations like that in the Mennonite Church, because the church is putting this weight on queer people of color. Those are a few of the things.
So where I currently sit in the movement, the strategy, again, is very campaign-oriented. I come out of the reconciling movement. I'm drawn to this work because in order to be a Christian, I need to love the church and to live into its values. In order to claim my country, I need to challenge it to live up to at least its constitution. So where I sit in terms of the strategy is that, and Sharon, you probably help me this because I might get it wrong, but we change the church to change the world, to change the church. Don't ask me who said that. That there's a moment before the campaign and a moment after the campaign. And so campaigns can do some very terrible things to communities. And so I look to transform that opportunity and basically stone soup, rock soup, whoever knows that metaphor, which is the campaign in and of itself can be pretty worthless. And you can quote me on that. I work for the Human Rights Campaign, but I think anyone that just sees value in a campaign is missing the point, is that there are huge resources that come to town. So I'll just give you an example, it may be easier. In North Carolina, when we had this conversation, and brought folks to the table that hadn't been there before, the conversation was, there's Prop 8 and Amendment 1 is coming to town. And let's have a real conversation about that is only being processed throughout the movement right now, because we have an opportunity to do it differently. And if y'all don't know what I'm talking about, Proposition 8 was sort of a learning moment for a lot of really good people who I know worked on that campaign. But essentially, the short version is, don't include people of color in the actual social justice work. Come to them at the end to put their stamp on it, and when you lose, throw them under the bus. That's the short version. And so nobody in North Carolina wanted to sign up for that. Why are the LGBT organizations coming now? I've never seen it out here before. So where I sit is that conversation in every state. And I just kind of replicate what we did in North Carolina. So my strategy is sort of a relationship one, and I just pray for y'all every day who are doing the work that comes before me and comes after me. The relational work, the what do we do now that we're in the room? But what my hope is to give people, as a relationship model, my dad, who's a pastor, said when he counsels couples, he doesn't have them sit and stare at each other and say, let me talk to you about you and talk about me. He says, go do something together. Go serve together. And so I try and create opportunities for people who wouldn't otherwise ever have a reason to relate to each other, to care about the same thing in that intersection of a campaign, to be in the trenches and come out transformed, to see people that were invisible to them before, and to see experiences that they didn't have any access to before. So that's my strategy, is to use the campaign as the stone soup for the cultural work that comes before and after that moment, so that we're passing something back that doesn't damage a community like California, but create something like a very LGBT inclusive Southern movement like we have in North Carolina.
One quick thing that I just thought of. I'm
You
so
could have
sorry.
2 quick things, bro.
Okay. No more than about a minute and 10 seconds. It's really interesting to think about the way that white media outlets frame the, you have the LGBT movement over here, and you have black people over here. This happened in Maryland in, I guess, 2012. a feature-length article that I saw in a Baltimore paper that actually lifted up the nuance of Black communities around homophobia, heterosexism, marriage equality, and thinking about how white communities are they're very quick to say that Black people are kind of wholesale homophobic and heterosexist. You know, you see these polls that say 54%, 59% of Americans are pro-gay marriage. Wonderful. And then they'll break down that with Black communities, Latino communities, Muslim communities, Asian communities, and you never see them say what the breakdown is in white communities. How do white people feel about gay people? Why do you pit your sin and your homophobia and your heterosexism and ultimately sexism off on the minority groups? You know, look at yourself in the mirror. And that's very frustrating when so many of us live at the intersection of ethnic minority, racial minority, sexual minority, and we're having these valuable conversations in our own communities, and our communities are nuanced, and the media is intent upon painting us as one-dimensional. And that's very frustrating, and we know that the religious right is behind that narrative. That the National Organization of Marriage, when they went in and were fighting for Proposition 8, they were saying, let's literally divide, let's parse out the people of color from the LGBT movement. And let's pit the Black churches against Prop 8. And so, again, it's white supremacy at work, doing this little dance and this kind of pitting each other, pitting us against each other, saying there's scarcity. And then it doesn't help when we have the Attorney General of the United States, who is a Black man, say that the LGBT movement is the civil rights issue of our day, supplanting Black civil rights movement of the 1960s. It is a civil rights movement of our day. It is not the. And again, that's this supplanting, this supersessionism, this scarcity that we're operating out of. When actually there's enough for all of us. There's enough for all of us.
Please add two things.
Just one. I'm really glad you said that. I think that is kind of missing what I was saying, and it's really important, is that there's a coming home, a reconciling of this divided identity, that the movement itself, in terms of strategies of the white-dominated movement, to think about, to use Maryland as an example, real talk, there were a lot of white-funded, rich gay white men who didn't want to invest in Maryland as much because it didn't fit the model of love and commitment and the strategy that was working around the rest of the country, because there were too many Black folks in Maryland, right? Some of the most educated folks in the country, but it just was too messy, right? So that cookie cutter approach was seen in a whole campaign. But I think that just the point that I want to drive home is, and I think leaders like Dr. Barber keep saying this, is that because of who he is in the movement, a lot more queer spaces are inviting him to speak, and that's a big step forward. But we are playing into our own problem by asking Black leaders to talk about the LGBTIQ movement, right? Because it's what he'll say is, it's time for y'all to come back home. This is the civil rights movement. It was here. It will be here. And when you try and divide those things out instead of seeing the white supremacy that's at the core of this and how all of these issues are being played off of each other, I think part of that strategy is to help folks not buy into that, just know how they're participating in that narrative. And I do it, everybody does it, but just to be more aware of that language, of calling that out when we start talking about the gay community and the Black community, or the civil rights movement and the LGBT movement. That's nuanced, but you know, the travesty is that Dr. Barber, I'm going to keep dropping his name, by the way, don't stop me, but he is one of the most savvy. He is the political action chair for the National NAACP. He's one of the greatest political minds in this country, in my opinion, and we're going to go in there and preach. He can preach too. And you would have the audacity to not consult with him about a civil rights issue in your own state, right? That's the epitome of racist assumption, right? That he only does Black things because he works at the NAACP. No, he is a great political mind, and so, I mean, I think it's just piggybacking on everything we said, but the strategy there is to continue to call out how we are participating in our own stereotype, I think, the movement itself.
So I'm going to trust that you will tell me if I'm derailing. I have been thinking about this model you're talking about of campaigns, and I have strong feelings about this because I've worked in political and electoral campaigns, and they're devastating to local communities. And I work at Christian Peacemaker teams now with a model I really believe in. So I'm biased. The model that we use at Christian Peacemaker teams is that we only go to places we are invited to, and then we only stand in solidarity in ways that our partners ask us to. We don't go places and say, hi, we're here, we're going to help you do stuff. Isn't the model of HRC ultimately still couched in the logic of white supremacy and whiteness? Here we come to save the day. To go somewhere where you haven't necessarily been invited to, and then to leave again after you've done the work that you thought was important to do.
Yeah. Sharon, you can still answer some of these questions. Yeah, no, I mean, again, I'm a preacher's kid, so I grew up in being a part of an institution that isn't perfect. So, yes, the answer to your question is yes. And people like Sharon Groves and MacArthur Flournoy and Donna Payne have been there for a long time, not doing work that way. It's a 250, it's like a church. We ebb and flow and move, and Chad Griffin comes out and apologizes for that thing we did 7 years ago, and you know, I think it's kind of like whereas intersectionality failed, it looks messier when you're doing it better, in my opinion. When you have the courage to say, we are moving out of a model that does damage, and there are a whole lot of people that work there, and that doesn't mean we come in and say, I'm one of the cool white folks, right? We say, like, where is the damage? I want to walk in solidarity with you. I want to look for the places. We have these resources as a very big footprint, but in working with the Moral Freedom Summer Project, for example, in North Carolina, where are we needed? Are we needed? You know, that kind of work that you describe happens a lot more at HRC than I think people realize. Does it happen the way you described? Absolutely, absolutely. And so then we call it out within our own institution, and we call it out in the world, and I think that's the only place you can start.
Please. So I think this is fascinating to me, and I think we have different work to do, and that there is a way in which the kinds of social, cultural locations that we occupy can inform that. Sometimes it's just about disposition. Some of us tend toward being more agitators, some of us tend toward peacemaking, as a kind of it's almost sort of in our own personality. And I think the important work, the most important thing that we could possibly do is to hold each other accountable. And so it's really, like, it made me go for a moment when you said, I don't read white people anymore. And I'm like, oh, okay, I got to think about that. And like, that's holding me accountable. And I was immediately accountable to, well, who's sitting on my desk? You know, like, what am I reading? What am I picking up? What's informing my work? And it's not that I have to replicate that, but that has to hold me. I have to, like, allow that, the charge of what that means. Like, so if I write a book tomorrow, you're not going to read it. Like, I got to, like, deal with that, right? And sort of think about, okay, what does that mean in terms of what I'm trying to do in the world and how I'm navigating my own space, right? And like, and the work that can be done. And I think that, like, I would just like you two to be in constant dialogue, because I think that as long as Ryan stays at HRC, which I think, like, you know, I don't get a paycheck there anymore. I can say these things. I think that the overarching framework is the white supremacist model. I do. But I think there are people that are doing really important work that are breaking through that. But they can't do it if they're doing it in isolation. So I think he needs to know about your work, and you need to say, that was bullshit what you all did. And you guys got to be in dialogue. That's the only way that I think we can make change. And that some of us are more sort of constitutionally, are more set up to be the agitator on the outside. And then there are others that are going to do it on the inside. And you've got to have both. But you've got to call each other accountable all the time. You can never, ever let that go. That's my sense.
And I mean, I'm sure I will read a white author one day.
I loved it.
Give it Sharon.
So it's complicated.
Very simple.
So what's interesting is we very quickly moved into relationality in talking about LGBTIQ justice. It happened when you talked about coalition building. And that's where I want to sort of talk about now, because I think for a lot of us, we've been we've assimilated, we've been colonized by gay in many ways. As much as we've tried to resist it, it has colonized our bodies. But there are other things happening in the world, in the nation, right? Some of what we talked about last night in the Ferguson call. And so that's where this question comes from. How can the LGBTIQ movements, because there's a plurality of them, how can the movements join together with other movements, for example, Black Lives Matter, to further enact intersectional justice?
I think it's, and lots of people have been talking about this, so I'm just repeating what people have been saying, is that, of course, we know the hashtag Black Lives Matter originated with 3 queer women of color. And it's really, we have to continue repeating that movement began before Michael Brown's lynching on August 9th, 2014, that this began in the wake of the lynching of Trayvon Martin. And so that work through that hashtag was already at play in 2013, I think it was after Zimmerman was found not guilty. So 2013. So we need to retell these histories over and over again, so we know these things begin Black Lives Matter began as an intersectional movement. Jennifer and I were talking about this earlier. This began as an intersectional movement. And so, we have to keep that spirit going. We have to keep these conversations going. We have to keep the mantra that if one part of the body is suffering, then we're all suffering. That my liberation is bound up in yours so closely that I'm not free until, in the words of some of these activists, you get free. And so instead of pitting ourselves against each other, we need to find these points of entry, of support for Christian people, of prayer, constantly holding all of these liberation movements in prayer, and knowing that these movements, yes, they're hashtags, yes, they're good talking points, but on a deeper level, these are deeply spiritual. And this is God's work, God's prerogative in the world, that people be free. And that God's Spirit cannot be contained, that it is a wind that blows where it wills. And I think in this moment, we could all lift up movements that we sense God's presence in. And so finding those points of entry, supporting each other, praying for each other, standing alongside each other as we suffer, and really give birth to a world where love reigns.
I was having a conversation earlier with a few folks about the intersection of these issues and some of these uncomfortable conversations that come up. And one of the things that I shared was, particularly as people of faith, the degree of intimacy and grace that needs to be worked at or desired in order to have these conversations on a perpetual basis. And the conversation, in the conversation I shared about us needing to be willing to enter into a covenant with one another where we say, I care so deeply for you, and I care so deeply for the things that bring your joy and the things that wound you, and I know you care the same for me, that I'm willing to be uncomfortable, I'm willing to be questioned, I'm willing to let go of some power and authority if necessary, I'm willing to be challenged, and that I won't get up and leave the table. And I think that that's the really important part, is there's frustration and there's anger and there's some very real pain there, and that whole wounded people wound people, that we very often, our reaction is to just get up and leave the table, or like, I can't deal with this right now. And I think that covenant is us saying, like, I will not do that. And that's person to person, that's organization to organization. That's when movements collide and realize that their work is not so far apart, and that they're going to be, they have to talk to one another, that they don't get to leave the table if they intend to succeed at what they're trying to do. So I think for us, for people of faith, we're trying to do this in a way that is leaning towards reconciliation, that is leaning towards unification in the body. It means making that covenant with one another. And I know that that's easier said than done, and that's where the intentionality part comes from. That's where the excessive grace part comes from.
So I go to a Unitarian Universalist congregation in DC, and the UUs have been leaders on marriage equality, and sometimes in this kind of uncomfortable way, well, actually, it's a way to avoid being uncomfortable, I think, in a way that it's like, okay, we're doing our justice work, we don't really have to do the race work because we've done this work. And it's a very progressive, largely white denomination. And there is some amazing young millennials that have been pushing the organization, and I'm just like, they're kind of those folks aren't backing away, but the institution is a little bit from where they're going. But this is the model I think we need. I'm wondering if intersectionality is losing its political punch, actually. What they said is, what would it look like if every single justice work that we did across the entire UUA, from economic justice, gun violence, LGBTIQ work, environmental justice, I'm sure I'm missing some. What if all of that work was done through the lens of Black Lives Matter? So like that's your starting ground for everything. And then and it just, I'm like getting goosebumps even as I say that, because if I think about what would it mean even if we took a year and we just decided Black Lives Matter was the frame for every single justice issue that we did, what would that conversation look like? What would it look like to do LGBTQ work when Black Lives Matter was at the forefront of what we were doing, rather than the thing that we add on at the end? Or like as you said, I think it's like, one of you said, like you get married, and then we'll have the next thing. It's like it is added on. So what would happen if that was at the center? What would happen to, you and I are in similar conversations about evangelicals, which always gets, it's like, conservative evangelicals, it's white, right? Like it's like evangelical read white. What would happen if Black Lives Matter was at the center of the reconciling work we're trying to do in conservative spaces? Whoa, right? Like, so I think that's I'd love to see that experiment actually take off. So.
Interesting.
So I'm just out here selling books for Dr. Barber, so I won't apologize, but you should ask him about the third Reconstruction. And I think, I love hearing him frame that, and that's the frame that helps me put logic to this, is what is this reconciliation of everyone? I mean, if you ask me what I did, I helped build coalition, a strengthened coalition, that I work with the model that we have. And that's what I hear described there is that everyone in North Carolina gets at the table and says, we are being beaten down by the same people, and we are falling victim to the plot to say that we're going to take turns in this, and I'm going to go out there and get slaughtered, and then you're going to go out there and get slaughtered. And just to have one leader, one prophetic voice say, we are under attack, and none of us, if one of us is attacked, all of us are being attacked. I mean, Dr. Barber says a lot of that. And so I think that's just, a lot of this is, the imagery of reconciliation is dear to me, because it's, the story I like is from a Spike Lee movie. I think it's due right there, I'm not sure. But, so there's a white guy who likes to play rap music, and he comes in, and there's this scene, and he sees this other guy who's black, says, he stole my radio. And he says, well, how do you know he stole his radio? You assume that. He says, how do I know? Oh, I don't know. The try not to swear.
You can swear. Let it out. I think I did.
Yeah.
The motherfucker tried to sell it back to me. Right? And so I think that's the thing, is that we think we're creating something new, and what we're trying to do is heal into where we started, right? So that's not a new concept, but it's something that we forget in movement and political work sometimes, which is why I think faith-based work is more than a notion. In its political sense, it's about an existing infrastructure of people that know how to do movement work, especially in the South. You can't move through political networks in the South without the existing infrastructure of the church. But the spiritual aspect is that this isn't new. This is something we've been divided and then told that we are broken and need to do something new, right? This is a new concept, and we've just forgotten that these are all connected. And so I guess that's the spirit of what I hear people saying, is that what does it look like is what it looks like for us to be whole. So this isn't new work, right? We go to work with churches, and politics don't belong in the pulpit. We did a thing called the Jeff Crum Conference on Prophetic Ministry in North Carolina because the predominantly white folks in that church had forgotten that the founding pastor of that church came from the movement with Reverend Lawson and got them kicked out of their first church, because the guy who owned that church said, if you have another black pastor preaching this pulpit, I'm going to take away the land that I promised you for the church. So that's the very foundation of that church. And then later they see Dr. Barber, and he scares the hell out of them, and they're like, we're not political, we're Christians, right? So this is a history of forgetting, I guess, is my point. And so that's the reconciliation work. That's not the new thing. That's the very, very old thing.
So, State of the Movement talks, if you've been to national gatherings like Creating Change or like the United States of America when the president does it, it's one voice that gives this sort of state of the movement, right? But what we have here it is a plurality of voices that meet at interesting points along the way, which I thought was important as we talk about enacting intersectional justice, as we think about transformation in the world. So we have 5 minutes, so that means you're limited. And I'm just wondering if folks want to, in a sentence or two, just say, like, this is where we are in the movement. And sort of wrap up.
I'm just going to recycle what I said at the Pink Meadow State of the Movement speech when we had our conference. The state of the movement is fabulous, it is fierce, and it is fucking sacred. Look at us. Are we not fierce? Are we not fabulous? And are we not fucking sacred?
Mine's way less exciting. I'm going to use half a minute for one thing and half for the other. I wanted to say really quickly, just for what you were saying, is that I think part of the thing we have to remember is that there is reconciliation that needs to happen between people of color groups amongst themselves. That I think is causing division, that is limiting our ability to work on the issue of white supremacy. And I just want to name that there's some very real work that needs to be done between people of color communities. To answer your question, Robyn, I think at least through the lens of the work that I'm doing, I'm realizing that we have reached a point where those in the church that you're going to reach just with the why can't you just love, why can't you just accept argument have been reached. What's left now are those who need you to say you can maintain a high regard for Scripture, there is a sound theological argument for inclusion and affirmation, here's what it is, here's how you best articulate it, and here are the tools you need to go and do that in non-affirming communities. And so that's the work that we're doing, that there are some people where it's never just love me, just accept me is never going to be enough. And they need to be able to reconcile their faith or how they understand their interpretation of Scripture with what you're asking them to do in terms of full inclusion. And so for me, that's the state that we're in, is where that needs to be done. And I think there needs to be an acknowledgement that we look at things as if there's faith work for LGBT and there's political work for LGBT. But those are not separate things. And if you can enact real change in the conservative and the evangelical congregations, you will see change, unprecedented change, on a political level. Because it's a changing of hearts and minds happening in the church, and those are the people who are pushing forth these amendments, who are pushing forth these bills, who are protesting and standing against the LGBT community. And if you can reach them in their churches and in their communities, that is going to affect the political platform. I think we need to acknowledge that and realize that. I mean, we have people in our organization who are don't even identify as Christian, but they're invested in the work that we're doing because they know it will impact their quality of life outside of the church. And I think we need to recognize that.
In the words of Katrina Goodlett, who left this comment on Facebook, this is the state of the movement from my perspective. Many trans people of color I know don't even have access to safe and affordable health care or housing.
So I think we're in a state of mourning and crisis, that our institutions, our way of doing work is no longer viable. And with that emerges conversations ways of thinking that are new and really exciting, but also they're also scary because they don't have a foundation behind them. So I think the state of the movement is in a state of transition.
Well, I don't get to hang out with theologians that much, so I'm just going to drop the biggest theological word that I know, which is metanoia. But basically how that was described to me is actually in a very personal example of the moment where the thing you were called to do isn't what you're called to do anymore. And you have to move against the momentum of the familiarity of where you were going. And the thing where you fought like hell, like let's not throw the history of people who have fought and died to get us to this place and still challenge that that's not serving us anymore. So that's the word I would use.
Thank you. So, Transform has been meeting for 5 years, and since its inception, it's been a queer, inclusive, queer positive space. There has been something on LGBTIQ issues since the beginning. This is the first day of the movement, and, Steve and Holly invited me to think about this panel, and it's just good to be in cognito with friends, right? That's how we get work done, right? And I'm grateful for all of what you contributed. We're at time. It was great. Thanks.